Normandy had to be an operation involving very large forces from the first day of fighting to compel the enemy to engage with a substantial grouping. The Allied forces in Europe and North Africa practiced various landing scenarios and drew very meticulous conclusions from all these operations. The Allies paralyzed the enemy's communication across northern France even before the invasion. Naval gunfire support was crucial since the invading forces could not have fully developed artillery support with them at the time of landing. On D-Day, Allied aviation performed nearly 15,000 sorties. From the perspective of other armies' experience, this was simply an unattainable level. France was the soft underbelly of the Third Reich. Even Panzer divisions could not be the tool through which the Germans could stop the attack in Normandy. But only two countries in the world could have carried out the landing in Normandy. Landing in Normandy, June 6, 1944. One of the symbols of World War II, especially in the West, in the United States, it is a significant element of the memory of World War II. Celebrations related to World War II are observed by the Anglo-Saxons in their most symbolic places of remembrance, including in Normandy. It is a turning point of the war, a crucial battle. Operation Overlord is one of the most important operations of World War II. Examining it closely today from the perspective of preparations and its progression, we conclude that the Allies executed it in line with the Chinese proverb, "Fight only when you know you will win." This implies that the Normandy operation was destined to succeed. Only supernatural forces could have caused the American and British troops to fail. A total disaster, such as a typhoon in the tale of the failed Mongol invasion of Japan, where the kamikaze typhoon thwarted the invasion of the Japanese islands. The typhoon sank the Mongol ships and severed the invading forces on land from their supplies. Nonetheless, considering the Allied potential, the number of troops, logistical preparation, and the American industry's continuous production of new equipment in vast quantities, even after losing ports and parts of the invasion forces during a typhoon, the Allies would still be able to effectively defend Normandy. Later, with additional support and new supplies, they could restore their military potential. When the operation in Normandy began, it was a victorious endeavor for the Allied command and General Eisenhower. It succeeded because Germany, the opponent, was unprepared to repel it. Nevertheless, we cannot and do not wish to question the heroism and dedication of the Allied soldiers in Normandy. Still, they fought in conditions of clear superiority over the enemy. Many works by Anglo-Saxon historians after the war attempted to elevate the level of risk by claiming that the German forces in Normandy were much stronger than they actually were. However, asserting that Normandy was won from the outset would somehow undermine the symbolism of this great and crucial campaign. From the very beginning to the very end of the battles for France, the Allied forces fought under conditions of superiority in every aspect: numerical, logistical, technical, and situational awareness superiority. The Germans, on the other hand, fought in Normandy from the beginning to the end in a very unfavorable situation for themselves, battling an enemy that imposed the conditions of the game. It should be noted that the Allies worked hard to impose these conditions on the Germans before the battle for France. Before the Allied troops landed in Normandy, they had conducted several other landing operations. The Allied forces in Europe and North Africa practiced various landing scenarios and drew very meticulous conclusions from all these operations. Operation Torch in North Africa in 1942, Operation Husky in Sicily in 1943, and later that same year, the landing at Salerno in southern Italy as part of Operation Avalanche. There was also the failed operation at Dieppe in northern France. The Allied command drew several fundamental conclusions. First, the operation needed to be conducted with maximum air dominance. Before landing in France, it was necessary to establish a clear operational advantage over the enemy's air force. Second, the landing troops had to strike with maximum force immediately. The Allies could not repeat the landing at Anzio in Italy, where individual divisions landed and then waited in a small area until they were surrounded by German divisions. The Normandy landing could not resemble those in Sicily or Salerno. Normandy had to be an operation involving very large forces from the first day of fighting to compel the enemy to engage with a substantial grouping. Third, the enemy on the ground had to be maximally weakened. The battlefield needed to be isolated. Air attacks should not be concentrated solely on the landing area, as it would reveal the landing site to the enemy. The Allies paralyzed the enemy's communication across northern France even before the invasion. Fourth, the invasion forces required maximum artillery support from the moment of landing. In this case, naval gunfire support was crucial, since the invading forces could not have fully developed artillery support with them at the time of landing. During World War II, just as in all battles in the 19th and 20th centuries, victories were achieved with artillery. When we summarize the above points, we come to the conclusion that only two countries in the world could have carried out the landing in Normandy: the United States and Great Britain. For the operation to succeed, the Allies needed to have powerful strategic and operational air forces capable of achieving air dominance and conducting bombing raids on the enemy's rear, resulting in the isolation of the battlefield. On D-Day, Allied aviation performed nearly 15,000 sorties. From the perspective of other armies' experience, this was simply an unattainable level. Only the United States and Great Britain had such effective air forces. They also needed a gigantic war fleet, including battleships, destroyers, and cruisers in large numbers, not to mention the large landing and transport fleet. Again, only two countries in the world had such resources and capabilities: the United States and Great Britain. The landing in Normandy is the culmination of the strategic and economic industrial capabilities of these countries. Especially the Americans created a great war machine that enabled them to conduct such a spectacular landing with very large forces from the very beginning of the invasion. As early as 1942, it was practically demonstrated that ports should not be attacked, especially with small forces. Landings should be conducted on beaches. The invasion and subsequent battles in Italy showed that it is absolutely necessary to suppress the enemy's air force to avoid situations like those in southern Italy, where the Luftwaffe damaged many British and American ships. Maximum efforts must be made to at least suppress the enemy's air force. In early 1944, a few months before the Normandy landing, air battles began to achieve air dominance. The Allies succeeded in this. They did not destroy the German air forces, but they achieved air dominance, and the Luftwaffe unsuccessfully tried to regain air superiority, despite most of their air force being engaged on the Western Front. The Allies prepared for the landing in Normandy for many months, even years, to meet the conditions for conducting a successful offensive. Through the strength of their industry, their support base, the power of their economy, and their logistics, they created such conditions that it would truly take impossible for the Germans to repel them in Normandy. The Germans, on the other hand, were totally unprepared to repel the landing in Normandy. One of the myths of the Battle of Normandy is that the German forces in France were perceived as a very serious threat, especially the German Panzer divisions, which were supposed to pose a deadly threat, disrupt the Allies' plans, and push them back into the sea. However, this is a myth. The German Panzer divisions were present in France only on paper. In theory, the Germans had 10 Panzer divisions in France. In practice, the operational area of France, after its conquest in 1940, was transformed by the Germans into a vast logistical hub containing a huge number of barracks aimed at training troops and restoring the strength of the German army. Their army was rebuilding its combat readiness there. Completely new tactical units were also being formed, primarily intended for use on other fronts. France was their training, coordination, and concentration area. After the organization period, an infantry division or panzer division usually left France. It was directed to the Eastern Front, the Italian Front, or the Balkans. The Germans did not amass troops in France or form additional divisions whose task was to wait for the moment of invasion. They did not spend months gathering strength, especially panzer divisions. France was a region for restoring combat capabilities for the entire German army fighting on all fronts. If we look closely at the 10 panzer divisions stationed in France on that day, we conclude that only 6 were combat ready. The remaining 4 were either restoring their combat readiness or still in the process of formation. Moreover, the fact that a division was in France did not mean it was part of the army group tasked with defending France. France. The German army had a rather specific structure. There was a central command, the Armed Forces High Command, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, or OKW. There were also the commands of individual branches of the armed forces, the main command of the Western area, the Army Group Command, and the Reserve Army, which included divisions that were being restored or formed, among other places, in France. Looking at the map, one might conclude that a division is stationed at a certain location, but it turns out that this division has not yet achieved combat readiness. Such a division did not report to the commander of the defense of France or the Army Group Commander. To make it even more complicated, the Germans had several layers of responsibility. An army commander could use some divisions, but for others he needed the approval of the Army Group Commander. The Army Group Commander, in turn, had divisions under his command, but some could only be used with the approval of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. It was a very complicated system, which meant that the Germans had more soldiers on paper in a given area than the local commander could use in battle. In France, in June 1944, there were as many as 16 battalions of Panther tanks, even though there were only 10 Panzer divisions. This was because they were still training and coordinating for the divisions fighting on the Eastern Front. The same was true for the Tiger tank battalions, although there were significantly fewer of them. For example, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division on June 6, 1944, the day of the landing, was stationed in southern France. This division did not have its own Panzer regiment and was practically a motorized infantry division. After the Allied landings in Normandy, it was ordered to gradually move north to fight against the Allied forces. Before the Normandy invasion, it was assigned the 504th Heavy Tank Battalion, which was very formidable and increased its combat strength. However, a week before the invasion, an order came from OKW that on June 8th, the battalion should begin the process of relocation to Italy. When the landing in Normandy began on June 6th, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division was ordered to march north, but the 504th Heavy Tank Battalion did not move with them because its previous order had not been canceled. The battalion was sent to the nearest railway junction to be transported to Italy, according to the original plan. The attack on Normandy did not change the order. The 19th Panzer Division in the Netherlands at the time of the Allied landings was unable to fight because it had no tanks. The 116th Panzer Division, a new Panzer Division formed partially from a reserve Panzer Division that served training functions in France based on a motorized division. The 116th Division was stationed in northern France, but began moving towards Normandy in mid-July 1944, over a month after the Allied landings. The division was 100% complete in terms of soldiers, tanks, ammunition, and fuel supplies. However, it could not be directed into combat because it was in the process of rebuilding and had everything except for the crucial element of trucks. No division during World War II, whether Panzer or infantry, could move without trucks to transport heavy equipment, soldiers, supplies, and fuel. Trucks had to constantly run during battle to resupply, deliver ongoing supplies, and rotate soldiers. This led to the situation where, in June 1944, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps arrived in Normandy faster by rail from Lviv in eastern Poland than the 116th Panzer Division could cover 150 kilometers towards Normandy. Therefore, 6 out of the 10 Panzer divisions were ready for combat. The remaining ones were in the process of rebuilding. France was the soft underbelly of the Third Reich, where troops were trained and restored. The Germans were certain that the Allies would attack France in the spring of 1944, but they did not know exactly where and when the invasion would occur. Regardless of the defensive plans in France, the system of redistributing divisions from France to other operational directions continued. The war was being fought on multiple fronts, and the Germans had to redirect troops to threatened sectors, such as the need to support German forces in Ukraine. The newly formed Lehr Division and the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions were units formed in France with the idea of repelling an Allied invasion when it eventually happened. However, the situation on other fronts caused the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions to be redirected to Galicia in Central Europe, and they only returned to France in June 1944. The Germans did not have the luxury of calmly waiting for the Allied forces to land. Preparations were made to repel the invasion, but there were not sufficient forces to stop it. Throughout France, there were a total of 60 tactical units, including 10 theoretical panzer divisions, 1 panzer grenadier division, and nearly 50 infantry divisions. The majority of the troops were therefore infantry divisions, not panzer divisions. However, these infantry divisions also varied greatly in quality, combat capability, level of completeness, mobility, and effectiveness. They also defended, or rather occupied, the vast territory of all of France. They were divided into 2 army groups, Army Group B in the north and Army Group G in the south, with 4 armies, the 7th and 15th in the north and the 1st and 19th in the south. The Germans were dispersed, which applied to both the infantry divisions and the few panzer divisions. In the Normandy sector at the time of the Allied landings, there were a total of 3 panzer divisions: the 21st Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and the Panzer Lehr Division. After the war, the Allies tried to present the Battle of Normandy as more severe and critical than it actually was. One element of this narrative was the story that the Germans were certain the landing in Normandy was just a diversionary attack, and that they continued to wait at Pas-de-Calais while the Allied forces in Normandy grew stronger. The truth lies somewhere in between. As soon as the invasion in Normandy began, several panzer divisions immediately moved towards the beaches, including all those in the operational area west of the Seine River. The Germans responded very energetically from the start and did not underestimate the Normandy landing. Orders were promptly issued to direct specific units north. However, they had difficulty quickly transferring forces to the Normandy area and made mistakes. Some panzer divisions received orders to march 2 or 3 days after the landing in Normandy, and some even only after a week. Specific errors can be pointed out, such as the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, which was ordered several times to advance, halt, or even retreat. There was a certain chaos and difficulty in making clear decisions. On the other hand, it cannot be said that the Germans believed it was a diversionary operation. They directed an anti-aircraft artillery corps, several panzer divisions, and several infantry divisions there. However, these forces arrived in the battle area with significant delays, especially the infantry. The Germans found themselves in such an uncomfortable situation that as they sent in new forces, those already fighting were worn out and had suffered losses. They were unable to multiply their military potential. As a result, throughout the Battle of Normandy, while about 2,000 German tanks and tank destroyers were stationed in France, they were never able to gather more than 1,000 vehicles in one day. When the first 3 panzer divisions were sent to the battle area, after a few days of fighting, they suffered material losses. When new divisions arrived, those already there had significantly reduced combat potential. A similar situation occurred with the infantry divisions. Newly arriving units were more often replenishing losses than increasing German potential. Additionally, airstrikes significantly slowed the movement towards Normandy. The Allies executed the isolation of the battlefield masterfully. The Germans were primarily doomed by their lack of sufficient infantry and artillery. Having enough infantry and artillery was key to conducting effective battles. Allied forces at the landing sites gained an overwhelming numerical advantage because the individual beach sectors were defended by the equivalent of German infantry companies or battalions. At the time of the landing on the Normandy Peninsula, the Germans had only 5 infantry divisions spread over too large an area, which also had to repel air and parachute attacks. The German 21st Panzer Division was the closest to the beaches, and it reached the coast. However, it quickly withdrew due to the enemy's superiority and the lack of coordination with other tactical units. We will return to the 21st Panzer Division later. The Allies played the battle very wisely, with the sea landings also secured by parachute drops, which absorbed part of the enemy's blows. On the coast itself, the Allies had overwhelming artillery fire. Armored units approaching the coastal area were incapacitated by fire from the sea. The artillery fire from destroyers and cruisers was able to halt a panzer division's advance. The landing Allied divisions had an overwhelming firepower advantage. Except for the famous Omaha Beach, the landing forces came ashore without major problems. On Omaha Beach, American soldiers suffered heavy losses, but even the Omaha sector was captured quickly. The Allies were not pushed back into the sea because the Germans had no means to counterattack. There were no sensible reserves to execute such a counterattack. Normandy is famous for its hedgerows, but close to the coast, there were mined areas and a lot of open terrain, making it ideal for tank hunting by planes and naval artillery, which could fire dozens of kilometers inland. During the landings in southern Italy, the Allies realized that naval artillery was the decisive factor. German artillery in Normandy, on the other hand, was hopeless. There was little of it, and it had very little ammunition. When describing a battle, operation, or campaign, logistical issues are very rarely mentioned. The saying goes, logistics on the battlefield is not everything, but everything else without logistics is nothing. The logistical aspect of this campaign shows us that the Allies could not lose. For every German artillery shell fired, they could respond with 40 of their own. The Germans had enormous problems with the availability and delivery of ammunition to the battlefield. A key tool, even on the modern battlefield, just as during World War II, is artillery. For it to be efficient and functional, it must not only have a good reconnaissance and fire control system, but, most importantly, it must have a steady supply of ammunition. The Germans did not have much to shoot with at the Allies, who were unloading new forces every day and building artificial ports on the beaches. The Allies delivered supplies in a way that no one had done before. It was a full display of modern industrial powers. On the other hand, the German 7th Army had artillery ammunition reserves equal to 17,000 tons, which theoretically would have been enough for 17 days of fighting. The problem, however, was that the German 7th Army was not capable of firing 1,000 tons of ammunition daily. The ammunition delivery system was not functioning properly, and some depots were hit by the enemy. The motor transport system was increasingly ineffective. The Allies had achieved air dominance after fierce aerial battles, and the Germans had serious problems delivering ammunition to their guns and moving the guns themselves to the battlefield. For some weapons, there was no ammunition at all. The Germans had many types of artillery equipment, including captured Soviet, Italian, and Yugoslav guns. Ammunition for these was particularly scarce. They were not even able to sustain the level of fire intensity they normally maintained on the Eastern Front, yet they were fighting an enemy far more powerful than on the Eastern Front in every aspect. The 21st German Panzer Division, which we mentioned earlier, the one that reached the beach, achieved nothing. It did not push the Allies back into the sea. The Allied command was most afraid of a counterattack by the Panzer divisions, considering them the only real threat. However, the Germans could not deploy more than 3 Panzer divisions on a single operational front at once. After the landing in Normandy, they immediately sent everything they had there. The 21st Division, stationed in Normandy, was the closest, but one Panzer division could do little against such Allied superiority. It got entangled in a series of local fights, causing one of the combat groups to reach the beach, but then quickly withdraw. The division's actions could not be coordinated with other types of forces or other divisions. There was no possibility of cooperating with strong artillery and infantry. We should not mythologize German Panzer divisions as forces capable of everything. One division was definitely not enough, and additional divisions were arriving slowly. The Germans also lacked infantry divisions for support. Panzer divisions could not leave the front line. They had to serve as line divisions. In theory, infantry divisions should hold the front line, while panzer divisions execute counterattacks to break through the enemy lines from behind them. In Normandy, German panzer divisions were immediately tied down on the front lines, serving as front-holding divisions. This caused them to lose their ability to conduct offensive operations. The German plan was to gradually bring all the divisions from France to Normandy and execute a counterattack. This was impossible because as soon as a new panzer division arrived, it had to replace the worn-out one. The Allies were constantly attacking, and the divisions had to hold the front. In the British sector around the city of Caen, there was a stalemate. The British were slowly capturing the city, which, in theory, was supposed to be taken on the first day of the invasion. Meanwhile, the Americans in the west cut Normandy in half and captured the city of Cherbourg. They then moved south, attacking quickly and continuously, amassing forces for further strikes. The Germans in Normandy were bleeding out. They were unable to gather sufficient forces in Normandy to increase their combat potential. The Germans gradually brought in more infantry divisions to replace the worn-out ones. They were fighting an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. Normandy was treated by the Germans as a mortal threat. The decision-making paralysis and parallel command structures contributed to a delay in the German reaction. Within 14 days, everything that could be sent to Normandy and was combat-ready began moving towards Normandy. If something remained stationary, it was because it could not move, as some of these divisions were waiting for tanks, trucks, or other equipment. Even Panzer divisions could not be the tool through which the Germans could stop the attack in Normandy. These units quickly arrived in Normandy but were unable to achieve much. They were pushed into a defensive role due to the lack of infantry divisions. In the city of Pas-de-Calais area, where the Germans initially expected the attack, the strength of the German defense lay mainly in the strong coastal artillery and the heavily fortified region. However, most importantly, there was a high concentration of infantry divisions, twice as many as in Normandy. The Battle of Normandy showed that the key factors are how quickly you can mobilize units, how much artillery you have, how efficient your logistics are, and how many shells you have for your guns. This is more important than how many tanks you have. If the Germans had a lot of good infantry in Normandy, the Panzer divisions could have operated as they should. However, they were used in a way that Panzer divisions theoretically should not be used. The logistical support for the German army was disastrous, which led to the Germans being unable to effectively stop the Allied forces that were increasing their military potential using artificial ports and unloading on the beaches. Despite this, they maintained the initiative and had the advantage. The German forces, commanded by General Rundstedt, threw everything they had to push the Allies back into the sea. In the given situation, this was clearly insufficient, but that is topic for another story. After all, war is a system.